Greetings gamers, my name is Anto and today I want to talk to you about one of my favourite ways to start campaigns, and that's with prologue sessions. This video is sponsored by the Tome of Mystical Tattoos Volume 2, more on them later. So one of my favourite ways to start a new TTRPG campaign is with a prologue session. This is a session that is kind of separated from your main campaign, but does a bunch of really useful things that I want to talk about today. Now there are a couple of different approaches to a prologue session depending on what system you're running, and what you want to get out of it is going to depend on which of these you go for. My personal favourite, but the one that is the most time intensive, is the solo prologue. This is where you take each of your players and you run a dedicated single one-shot for their character that introduces them to the world, tells you a little bit about what this character was doing immediately before the campaign starts, and gives you some time one-on-one with the player to develop that character. Doing this is more time intensive than doing it as a group or not doing prologue sessions at all, but in my experience you end up with characters that are a little bit more developed. You get to play through some of their backstory, and the players come to the table for their group sessions with a much clearer idea of who their individual characters are. In my last campaign, in the Cursed Sands of Ashk, when we had had a TPK and we were building a new party, I decided to offer all of the players the chance to run a solo prologue session to introduce them to the world and to these new characters, and it was a lot of fun. The most memorable one was two of the players were playing a pair of brothers, and they started as thralls aboard a mind flayer ship that was under attack, and they ended up escaping and fighting some mind flayers and kind of jumping ship and ending up in our campaign setting on the run from mind flayers. That in itself, super cool concept, but having played through it where they got to fight their way through the Nautiloid and make their escape made them much more invested in that part of the story. That meant later on when I reintroduced mind flayers, they saw the Nautiloid and were like, nope, we're not going back up there, we're not even entertaining that, we know what's up there, we're getting out of it. If you're enjoying this kind of content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We have new videos coming out every single week. Another option for a prologue session is to get the whole group together and hold some kind of one-shot or introduction that is kind of separated from your main campaign. Now this can either be separated fully, so whatever they play in the one-shot has nothing to do with the campaign, or it can start to put down some of the seeds of your campaign. The benefit of running a group prologue session is obviously you get the whole group together. You only have to do it once and not once for each individual player, but it does mean that it just feels like the first session. You have to do a bit more work to make it clear that this is a prologue session, that it has different goals. The goal with this isn't to dive into the story and to just get started with the campaign, it's to dig into your character's backgrounds. So if you are playing a campaign where the adventurers are starting at a slightly higher level, maybe your prologue session would have them at a lower level on a previous adventure. If they've been together for a while, have one of their earlier adventures be your prologue, figure out how did they meet, run through an adventure with them together so that when you start the campaign proper, they have some actual tangible experience together that they can draw on in those inter-character relationships. And then finally, one of what I think is the most fun versions of a prologue session is the Gauntlet. This is something that's existed since the earliest days of D&D, and it's really popular in a lot of OSR games. But the premise is, as a player, you build 3 or 4 or 5 first level characters, all of you, and then you take this group of adventurers into a dungeon or a similar location, and whoever survives, those are your characters for the main campaign. Not only is this hilarious and fun because you tend to roll all of the characters randomly, so you end up with some really bizarre combinations, but it also means that you have that attachment to a character because they have lived through an adventure where others have died. This also allows the players to experience several different kinds of characters, and they might have several survivors and they get to pick which one, but they've got a little bit of experience with each to understand how they play and to know what they want from the full campaign. Before we talk about the purpose of prologue sessions, I'm really interested to hear whether you've ever run any prologue sessions and what it is that you did with the characters. Were they on their own or part of a group? Let me know down in the comments below. So now we know what kinds of prologue sessions we have, let's talk about the purpose of them, because it's not always clear why you would want to do this. So one of the biggest reasons you might use a prologue session is to introduce your players to a new system. If you have moved away from your current system, you're picking up a brand new system, a prologue session can be a really good low stress way to introduce the system. You say, hey, we're going to run this adventure. It's not going to be tied to the whole campaign. It's a lot less pressure, but we're going to get used to the system. Another really useful thing about the prologue session is it can introduce your world. A prologue session is an ideal way to introduce some setting information to your players, maybe have them play through a historic event. If you're playing a campaign, for example, that has some kind of apocalypse or some really big event that has happened that has changed the world and the players are going to be experiencing this changed world, a prologue session is a really good way to give them first-hand experience of the world before as well as that turning point. An example from my current campaign in the Dual Cities, had my players decided they wanted to start their adventures in the Desk Empire, I would run a prologue session where they were playing as soldiers in the Desk Empire's army, and they would have been present at the Battle of the Burning Cascade. This is a pivotal moment where the former emperor of this region was killed by his wife and there was a whole coup, and it destabilized the entire nation and provides context for the current situation and political climate in that region of the world. So if my players had decided we want to adventure in that part of the Dual Cities, that would have been their prologue session, because that would have set them up to understand the existing kind of geopolitical landscape of that part of the world. A prologue session is also a great way to set the tone and to get a gauge on how the players feel about the tone. So if you say to your players, I want to run a really grimdark, gothic horror setting that's going to be really bleak, and you play a prologue session and you run that tone and the players hate it, maybe you should consider changing it and dialing it back, and you can work on that and figure out how to find a nice balance. You'll also get a sense from the players themselves what kind of tone they're bringing to the table as well. So if you are expecting a level of seriousness in the campaign and all of your players come and they immediately make kind of jokey characters and there's a lot of levity and joking between them, maybe you can look at that and go, wow, maybe I need to decrease the seriousness a bit and increase the brevity. And then the last big reason to run a prologue session is to introduce the characters and give them some time to shine. This is particularly useful in a solo session because you get a couple of hours one-on-one with the player and their character, probably something that's not going to happen again in the campaign, and it really lets them explore their character, figure out who they are, figure out what they want, where they've come from, and it gives you so much fodder as the GM to pull from later on. So if you have a solo session with a player, you can pay attention to everything that they're saying and doing, introducing characters from their background, figuring out what makes them tick, and you can introduce that in the main campaign, and it makes the player feel like they are much more ingrained in the story. This video is sponsored by the Tome of Mystical Tattoos Volume 2, now on Kickstarter. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you know I am a big fan of magical tattoos. I think they are a really interesting way to introduce magic into your games. That's why I'm really glad that today's sponsor is Nat Ones and their Tome of Mystical Tattoos Volume 2. This is the sequel to their excellent first Mystical Tattoo volume, and it introduces over 200 new magical tattoos with mechanics for D&D 5e. This campaign is funding a beautifully illustrated book, absolutely jam-packed with illustrations of various magical tattoos and what they do. Every tattoo in the book includes mechanics for what the magic of that tattoo is, as well as an illustrated diagram of how the tattoo is going to look upon your character's body. Not only that, but each tattoo also includes lore that you can use to sprinkle into your world, make this form of magic feel more real to your players, and you can even play as fully fledged tattooist classes. Not only can the Marked, which is the new tattooist class, provide magical tattoos for your players, but they also have their own unique powers that come into play in battle in their own right. The campaign is already fully funded and has already started smashing down stretch goals, including new tattoos, new class-based systems, and new adventures. Head to the link below to check out the Kickstarter now, and thanks again to Nat Ones for supporting the channel. So finally, I want to give you a couple quick tips on how to actually run a prologue session, because they are a little bit different to a normal session of your typical TTRPG. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is you need to keep it focused. The prologue session isn't about spanning 8 different locations and going on a grand old adventure. It's typically narrow focus on a single player or this group of players in this specific moment. So you want to keep it limited to 1 to 2 locations and keep it entirely focused on the characters. Now, obviously, you want to introduce your world and the tone and the setting and things, but everything should be through the lens of the characters, always coming back to them. How do the characters see this event happening? How does this particular event impact them? How do they perceive this world? The next thing is combat is not the most important part of a prologue session unless you're running a gauntlet. So the purpose of the gauntlet is obviously to whittle down the number of characters so that you have your beginning roster for the full adventure. To do that, you're going to need a lot of combat. But if you're not running a gauntlet, then you don't necessarily need to have a lot of combat. Any combat that you do have should be really character focused. And then the next tip I have is to only use the most engaging of NPCs in your prologue session. Like I said before, the purpose of these sessions is all about the character. So you don't want to be introducing them to NPCs that don't have a vital purpose or who aren't super engaging. So you don't want a roster of 20 different NPCs for them to engage with and interact with. You want to keep it narrow, keep it focused, but make sure the NPCs that they are engaging with are memorable, because these are NPCs that you can introduce in the future and give that character an immediate touch point to go, hey, I know that person, I know what to expect from this interaction. And then my last big tip for running prologue sessions is end early. You want the players wanting more. You don't want the session to overstay its welcome. As soon as you've done what you set out to do, be that introduce a key element of their player's backstory or have them witness a specific event or run through the gauntlet, as soon as that objective is complete, end the session. The goal here is you want the players to be excited to get into the main campaign. You don't necessarily have to end on a cliffhanger, but don't give them a huge amount of time at the end of the session to go and speak to random people and to do random busy work around the location they're in. Introduce the main point of that session, complete it, and then get out. So there we have it. Those are my quick tips for running a prologue session. I do think they are one of the best ways to really give a shot of adrenaline into a character before they ever start playing the main campaign. I'd love to know what you think about it down in the comments below. And if you're interested in how I build out my campaigns and get my players ready for them, check out this video right over here, which talks about how I made the campaign setting introduction for my players, as well as what I did to build my current campaign, the Jewel Cities of Talavar. But until next time, happy gaming.